Blackwell. I'm so happy that you're joining me today on Express Yourself, this week's talk show with Choice FM 92.1. I know you're jumping in your cars and getting ready to head home to work. I'm sure you're tired. It's a cloudy day, trying to get home before the storms happen. So I'm hoping that you are focused and I'm going to try to give you a little energy on your way home from a hard day at work. And if you're still at work, taking your break, I hope you're somewhere tuned in listening to our good conversation today. I have with me a very special guest, a good buddy of mine. We've worked together in many ways, have come to know and respect his persona, his integrity, and his acumen. And I want to introduce you to him again today. He was on the show last week, Dr. Darron Smith, hailing from Seattle, Washington. He is a PhD physician assistant. He's a researcher. He's a therapist. He's a practitioner. And he is all things about mental health and wholeness and healing. We started our conversation last week and had a great conversation about mental health manifestations in all people, but especially in the Black community and specifically in families and how we show up as a people every day in mental health. So Darron, welcome to Express Yourself. Really appreciate having you here. We're going to do a little talking, and then a little later, we're going to open up the phone lines for you. So be on the lookout for the time when we're ready to talk to everybody. But I just want to give Darron a few minutes, Dr. Smith, a few minutes to just chat with us a little bit about mental health. Why don't you tell us, Dr. Smith, about how Black people in particular show up in the mental health space? What is it different about Black people from other people about how we process trauma, how we deal with challenges that makes perhaps treating patients that you see of color a little differently from everyone else? Or is there a difference? Are we all the same?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me back again. It's wonderful to be with the audience. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to call and I'll try to address any of the questions you may have. So yes, brother, thank you for having me back on the show again. We were having such a great conversation the last time. So let's see if we can recreate the magic. So I think what needs to be said here is that African Americans are exposed to an enormous amount of racial stress. Much of it is unnoticed. It's the slights, the cheers, when I say jeers, I was at a conference and I said jeers, and somebody thought I said Jews, and it was a big old ruckus. There they go, white folks again. You just have such a bad negative bias toward Black folks. And I think that's extended into Black people as well. But back to my point here. So Black folks are exposed to an inordinate amount of racial stressors daily. It could be hair touching, it could be name calling, it could be just general disrespect. And the accumulative, and that's just one manifestation. The accumulative effect of the day in and day out of being dehumanized and marginalized in society has a psychological and physical toll on the body. With enough frequency and enough veracity, if you will, Black people can progress into race-based PTSD, which is a very unique kind of PTSD. It's the kind of PTSD where nobody really puts their hands on you, but they're enacting psychological violence. And that actually shows up quite a bit in the research and the data on PTSD. Black people are exposed to PTSD much more than whites. And not everybody ends up having PTSD-like symptoms. There's also, which would be things like nightmares, difficulty sleeping, anger, irritability, lashing out at folks, this kind of thing. Difficulty going outside, not wanting to be around anybody, sort of isolating oneself. Of course, if one has been to a theater of war, it could be a sound, it could be a gunshot or a can dropping or something like that might re-trigger these feelings that people can sometimes get with PTSD. That's one manifestation. The other kind is that people sometimes develop, or just through their own natural ways and being have these natural coping factors that protects them against the things that we see and the things that people do to each other, the kinds of treatments that humans enact upon each other that causes these kinds of things to occur. So African Americans are disproportionately exposed to PTSD. We're more likely to see violence, live around violence, or have violence, have some sort of violence enacted in our families. And I want to say one thing about that. Sometimes religious violence is something that's often not looked at.
Mm.
One has to conform to orthodoxy, right? One has to live a life that's according to someone who is the pastor of the flock where individuals attend. Sometimes that kind of impossibility of reaching these impossible goals and the way in which people use religion and weaponize it, to the detriment of people who are practicing it. So some of that is also important to recognize too. So yes, we are exposed to a lot of race-based trauma in our lives. Just being Black, just being born with more melanin in your skin. And there's really some truth to your skin is your sin, because we live in a society and I want people to realize this, we live in a white supremacist society. It's a white supremacist, capitalistic, patriarchal society to be precise. And with that comes, 400 years of a legacy of slavery, a legacy of dehumanization, raping, pillaging, stolen labor, and all of the rest of it that came with our ancestors. So all of those horrors that took place, which started around the late 1600s, 1670s, when African Americans and whites began the status of indentured servitude began to change, and whites just didn't take too good to bondage in that way. And so Black folks, after trying white folks first as slaves, and then of course Native Americans, African Americans became the natural choice because of course we stood out in the community. So that legacy and that history has been epigenetically transmitted, and epigenetics is a sort of a subdiscipline that one would find when you're looking at genetics. And what epigenetics argues is that our genes, our DNA is intact. In other words, you have a nose, you have eyes, you have lips, all that stuff is genetically programmed to turn out the way it's supposed to turn out, unless it doesn't. But so genes can be modified.
Go ahead.
Genes
Okay.
can be modified. And what modifies our genes is the environment in which we're brought up. And I'll pause there, my brother, please.
Yeah, you said so much. I just want to be able to unpack it for a minute. Great stuff, not just good stuff. So are you saying that when you are born as a person of color, regardless a Black person, whether you have two Black parents or one Black parent, however you came into this earth, when you are born, because of the generational trauma that has been experienced by hundreds of years of ancestry and your ancestors having violent, traumatic experiences, those things can change your DNA codes. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely, that's what I'm saying. Yes.
And then when you have a lived experience, let's just talk about health disparities. So most Black children are born in situations where their moms go through trauma through the whole birthing process, not just because birthing is a hard issue, but because their moms face undue racism and manifestations of racism in our care system, So the statistics say, at least in North Carolina, but across the United States and certainly in Rocky Mount, that Black babies have lower birth weights, they have higher mortality. Black moms have a more traumatic experience as far as believing that the pain that they have is real, that their pain should be treated the pain is not as extreme enough to need the epidural early or whatever those,
right.
anesthesia treatments are, and so because they're not believed and they're not supported at the same level that white women are, the whole birthing process is much more traumatic. So you're born into a world that is hostile. And then when all of the lived trauma that we have, and everybody, if you're Black, you already know if you're raising a Black child, what you have to tell your child about driving and the speed limit. Be careful what you do. Be careful what you say. Be careful how you dress. Be careful where you go. And while we're creating that level of fear inside our children, we're also telling them you can be anything you want to be. You can reach for the stars. You can break every limit. So doesn't that create some internal mental stress and some pressure that is hard to resolve? Am I overstating it, or is that reality
No, it's reality.
for how we do it?
I think you're describing the tension that exists within us when we have these conflicting ideas, these conflicting notions. That's why we have mentors and people there to kind of give us some context with all of this and help us to sort of navigate the subtleties of which these things exist. And they're much more difficult for Black folks. Now, you had talked earlier about the notion of pain, and what I had mentioned before, that Blacks are exposed to all these different kinds of racial traumas, racial stresses. One particular bias that shows up in white folks is this idea called superhumanization bias. And when you think of superhumanization or superhumans, you're thinking about people like, for instance, maybe Batman. I'm just kind of
yeah, that's right. That's
folks,
right.
But this particular superhumanization bias is unique to Black people, or at least in terms of how white people perceive Black people. That Black people are impervious to pain, and we can withstand pain, physical pain, and emotional pain, more so than white people can. So this is the belief, and so this is one of the driving forces in healthcare, and it speaks to providers who don't look like the patients that they're serving, because they're operating on racial stereotypes and assumptions, right? Because we have no way of deconstructing these things. When we've tried to do that, there's been too much pushback from white folks. They ain't trying to hear that, and then also pushback from Black folks, right?
Yeah.
It's hard. I mean, when you're saturated and exposed by this system of white supremacy, we're all victims of it. We're all exposed to it to certain degrees, to some more than others. I think about characters like Clarence Thomas, for instance, or people like Candace Owens. These extreme, or even for instance, your crazy lieutenant. Can I say that? Your lieutenant colonel. I might want to edit that out. Editing room, you may want to go back and cut that one out. But these extreme
is live, yeah.
It's like their voices screaming in the wilderness, right? And so you think about why a person would do that. Why would a person, completely go against, group position? And I think about it this way, you talked about fear, you talked about earlier, and that's another interesting point. But I think for some Black folks, it's a protective factor. They look at it in terms of something that's fear-based. And so they look at something that, if I can't beat them, I'm gonna join them. And I think people do that to sort of.
It's survival. Their perception of survival. What do you think?
They delude themselves into believing that by doing that, right, they're protecting themselves against what all of us as Black people experience daily, microaggressions, day in and day out, right? So if I join these folks over here, I won't experience that. Well, that we know that's not the case, but that's the way some of these folks rationalize. They're just extreme. Like Clarence Thomas hates Black folks. He cannot stand Black people because everything he's done from a legislative Supreme Court standpoint has been against the interests of Black folks. So he clearly got an issue. Ben Carson, another one. So we talk about these things, when you talk about these conflicts earlier, this is what I'm talking about. These conflicts can lead to these kind of identity clashes, right, that exist, where some Black folk think that they ain't Black, or think that the white man's Kool-Aid tastes better than the Black man's Kool-Aid.
Right.
I'm here to say
And first of all, let me just say this: the opinions that we express here are our own personal opinions, and not the opinions and not the position of Choice FM 92.1. These are We're two men talking, and we're two men who have a shared experience of being Black men in America. We've been raised up in it. We have different pathways, but we dealt with the same issues, haven't we? And what I'm also saying to all of our listeners is that we've got to learn how not to normalize racism. I heard a term with a group of folks um, when we were in a conference last year. And I thank you, Gwendolyn Swain. Gwendolyn said that definitely is your reality. It's my reality. It's our reality. I heard a concept, a term I had never heard before, a term called mammyism. Let's talk about mammyism. What does that mean, Darron, when you hear that? What does that mean to you?
It sounds like a caricature. One of the
Yeah,
caricatures that Black women were subjected to during the age of slavery.
right, right. And the concept behind it was that, and I learned this from my Yze in New York. The concept behind that is that Black people have such a pressure to relieve the stress and the shame and the pain of racism. And what we have a tendency to do as Black people is not want to express the harm that's caused and created by undue focus and attention in a negative manner around color and around race. And so we'll be sitting in a conversation and we'll find ways to not have to talk about issues when you know the issue is race focused. We're so hypersensitive to calling, quote unquote, the race card. It's sort of about the spirit behind this whole movement of anti-wokeness, anti-DEI. Read an article today that University of North Carolina, like universities in Florida and other places all across this country, are finding ways to dismantle opportunities that were opened up for a very brief moment in time to begin to level the playing field for Black folk in education and business and economics and social arenas. And so now there's this backlash against everybody because a few have made it through. So you're saying everybody should be equal, but you know it's not equal. How do you feel about that? How do you deal with that?
Well, I mean, I agree. I mean, what came to my mind when you were talking about this, Reuben, was victims.
Yes.
We often hear people say, don't play the race card, blah, 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 blah. I'm here to tell you, you don't have to play it. It's already playing.
It's played.
It's playing whether you playing or not. In your mind, it's playing.
Yeah.
And for something, I'll add this too. You are a victim.
Yeah.
You're a Black person in this country, you are a victim. You are a victim of white supremacy, the day in and day out grind of being Black, and the limited opportunities that Blacks get simply for being Black, no other reason, right? So we are victims. And when people say, well, you ain't a victim, yeah, I am. I'm a victim of white supremacy. Now, I didn't do it. And of course, I didn't do anything. I didn't own no slave. And nobody said you did, but you benefit from being white in a society that values whiteness.
Now let's unpack this, because there is a difference between saying and calling and helping people to illuminate the fact that there is a society that has created this disparity of access and opportunity. And because there's been an intentional disparity to limit access and opportunity to Black people in particular, is spilled over to impact other populations of color. And I find two realities that we are always having to deal with is that when we discuss the concept of BIPOC, and what that means is that there is a whole diaspora of people of color, from Asian to Latino, to Native Aboriginal peoples, to Africans and African Americans. But there's been no ethnic population that has experienced the level of intentional oppression and violence other than Black people on the face of this earth in the widespread manner that has been created, that's been imposed upon us, and then entire systems of opportunity. banking systems, education, so banking, we aren't supposed to own money. We weren't supposed to get through. We got redlining for housing. You got credit scores that were created to keep Black people intentionally from being able to borrow money. You had Black banks that were decimated. When we tried to do business with ourselves, there was a brief period of time after doing Reconstruction up until the early 1900s, and then 1920s to the 1940s, Black communities were decimated that were working together and working on our own. And all this stuff has created this traumatic reality that we live in today. So we want to unpack the problem, and then we want to talk about how do we deal with it, Darron. How do you feel about that?
That sounds great. And to add, to your remarks, none of this stuff happened in a vacuum, right?
Right.
You mentioned intentionality. You mentioned intentionality. I mean, there was a time in my life where I used to think to myself, why is all this shit happening to me? Just
watch your language.
Why is all this excrement happening?
That's doo-doo. That's right.
And is it me? Something I'm doing, and then as I began to, get into my own research and work, and then asking other folks, other Black professionals, if they're having similar experiences, and of course they are. So all of these things that we talked about, what you just, eloquently described as some of the larger systemic problems that exist within Black folks, trickles down to individual Blacks and ends up affecting us in our health. So when Black people are walking around always afraid of everything, right? It causes a neurobiological reaction inside of our body that impacts our fear response. So that fear response that causes us to breathe hard, our chest starts to beat when we see something we're afraid of, like stepping on a snake, for instance, right? And the feeling,
or a blue light flashing anywhere.
Or blue light flashing anywhere. Instant fear, right? Instant
anywhere.
Fear. So that same fear mechanism, right, is the same one our ancestors had. Now, why is that important? The chronicity of that, the persistence of that occurrence happening has biological impact on our health. It affects our cholesterol levels. It affects our glucose levels. It affects the degree to which we have plaque in our arteries, which would predispose us to, cardiac disease and a sudden death, MIs, diabetes, all of the diseases that kill folks, that shouldn't kill folks, kill us more readily than other groups, because you mentioned earlier, again, you said so many wonderful things, Reuben, all of this pain and frustration, it's got to go somewhere. And so some of the times it's turned to substance use disorders, right? People find alcohol as a relief. They smoke as a relief. They do more, gravitate to more destructive behaviors to compensate for all of this stress that nobody ever talks about. And we know that it exists, right? So the first part of the solution is to recognize that there is a problem, right? And that problem has a lot to do with not necessarily you as an individual, but rather a system that's in place that makes it more difficult for us as individuals to get ahead, because we're not, I call it selective assimilation, right? So living in a white supremacist society, then you got a little bit of a gap in this barrier where certain Blacks are allowed in. I think of Colin Powell or Barack Obama. They're allowed into this ecosystem, but the rest of us are sitting and looking and watching from the outside looking in, trying to change things. But all the process and the stress of that really can wreak havoc on our bodies, and really accelerate early death in African Americans, which oftentimes is the case. African American men have the worst health of any group in the country, if not the world.
Say it one more time. For all of you listening out there, for those of you listening,
African American men have the worst health and health outcomes of any group in the country. Basically, we dying from shit from excrement that we should not be dying from.
Right.
Because much of it is self-imposed, right? So we have to find better ways as Black people. We have to find better ways to cope. And the ways that we currently cope with our stresses are destructive, absolutely destructive for our communities, for our families. Community violence is one of the main precipitating factors in the death of urban Black men, young urban Black men.
So before we go to commercial break, let's sort of talk about internalized depression. You know, that we have a tendency, just as you stated, to take this frustration. First of all, you're born with a predisposition uh, to inculcate or incorporate negative manifestations of stress in your own body. Second of all, we operate in a culture where we know if you're Black, especially if you're a Black male, you're oppressed. If you're a Black female, you're undervalued automatically and predated upon. And then third of all, we got challenges in our social economic situations, our whole social determinants of health. We have more to deal with. Everybody doesn't have every issue. Some people are born in wealthy families and they might have everything that they need as Black people, but they still have to deal with bias. They still have to deal with discrimination, and they still have to deal with not feeling as good as, that imposter syndrome.
Right. That's
But
very true.
but
Very.
how we internalize this stuff, are you saying, is that we sabotage ourselves? We are self-destructive in how we look at ourselves individually and then how we treat others around us, how we normalize violence and how we normalize oppressing each other and buying into the concept that it's okay for us to be oppressed as a people. Because like Uncle Ruckus on the Boondocks, everything white is right, everything Black needs to get back. Is
That's
that
right.
right?
Right. That's right. Absolutely.
Okay. Okay, so we have established that we're on the same vibe, the same flow. We're going to take a break and pay some bills. So we're going to ask Doc, can you bring in the commercial? And then when we come back, I'm having great talk with Dr. Darron Smith from Seattle, Washington. You see that beautiful Black background if you're looking at him on Facebook and watching us on Facebook. We're going to come back in a few more minutes with more Express Yourself with Reuben Blackwell. Choice FM 92.1.
Choice FM is live at 5.
Express! But it's like this, the South got something to say. That's all I got to say.
Reuben Blackwell and Express Yourself on Choice FM.
Well, welcome back to more of Express Yourself. This is Reuben Blackwell, and I'm having great talk with Dr. Darron Smith. Dr. Smith is practicing physician assistant. Please forgive me, my brother, physician assistant in Seattle, Washington with the University of Washington. He's a researcher, a professor, a licensed therapist, brilliant, good brother in every single term in every way. We're talking about racism and its impact in how we show up as Black people in our mental health spaces. And we also want to talk about, Dan, we spent the first 30 minutes, first half of the show, really sort of diagnosing what the issues are and how they manifest themselves, what the contributing factors are to poor health and really specifically in mental health. Let's sort of dive in a little bit into to the mental health side of things. So first of all, who is mentally healthy? Are most people healthy, or do most people have struggles and challenges? How do you determine who has good mental health? Isn't everybody messed up in some way, shape, or form?
If you're born in America, you messed up. Messed up. You got something wrong with you. Okay.
You got something wrong, yeah.
Now, if that's something wrong with you rises to the level of disrupting the whole family, or causing destruction, or other areas that might be of concern, then that person probably needs to be seen. And let me give you a couple of different examples of that, what that might look like. For men in particular. Men, if you're listening to me out there, men, y'all need to stop tripping. What happens is that when men are having mental issues, they get angry. We get real angry, and we get ornery. We have a short fuse. It's called low frustration tolerance, right? Little things set us off easy. We have difficulties remembering things, difficulties sleeping at night, right? And even sometimes difficulties eating. Sometimes people eat too much or eat too little to make up for this. This is all reflective of what Reuben indicated earlier. All of this chaos that we're living with has to find a way to get out, to express itself. And so one of the ways we do it is in some of these self-destructive kinds of behaviors. But got what I was saying, man. Where was I going with this?
That destructive mental behavior.
I just said
You said you
got what I was saying.
no, well, but it's good stuff because basically what we are saying is that everybody starts life out. You know, if you live in a society, today's society has been crafted, it's been cultured, it's been designed by people who did not have everyone's best interest at heart. And don't think that racism, the impact of racism only hurts Black people.
Oh,
The
yeah.
impact of societal bias, bias to the extreme point where you have to sustain a whole system where people are not treated as humans, that hurts everyone. It's just that the people who it's directed to suffer more and greater disparate manner than anyone else.
That's right.
So can you help me help our listeners understand? Because sometimes people will process and they will interpret stances and truth around racism as if we're anti-white, or if people have relationships, love relationships with people from other races. The way Black people internalize is that you're not really Black if you love someone who is not of your race, or if you marry someone who is not of your race. And we also have a tendency to be more extreme about issues where marginalized groups related to gender, identity, or sexual orientation, we have a tendency to create another level of toxicity and trauma that we bear ourselves and that we impose on other people. Am I incorrect in my observation?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say incorrect. It is an observation. I would say that, first of all, this idea of separating us into Black folks and Latinos and all that, that's just completely artificial. We are all Africans, for the love of God. We're Africans. Okay? The difference that we see, the less than 1% of the differences that we see in each other amounts to the physiognomy of our lips, our nose, our eyes, these really superficial things that really have nothing to do with nothing other than the reasons where our genetics, our ancestors drifted when they left Africa. So all of this separating Black people, it's not natural for Homo sapiens to do that. And so that's an artificial notion that's been imposed upon us primarily by the West, by Rome, the Greeks, all these other barbaric, early white supremacist founders of systemic racism. This idea of separating people into different camps and different groups. I want to underscore that it's completely not natural. Okay, because at the end of the day, biologically, we are all the same. We all have the same doggone mother. She's an African. Y'all need to stop hating. Okay, hating on Africa, because at the end of the day, that's the cradle of our existence. And so, if you love somebody who is not of your race or whatever, then do your thing. Some folks would say, well, that might be a manifestation of self-hatred. It probably is. It probably is. I don't think that we can escape any of it. We escape it as best we can, but I want to underscore the fact that we are saturated by it. And it's so seductive that we don't realize oftentimes until we're sunk into it. When the self-hatred piece gets to the point to where, you begin to disidentify with people who look like you, that's where the problems come in, right? Where you begin to hate people who look like you through no fault of their own, were born into this situation where they were born into. This is very, very stuff. They've done studies on this. They've done studies on, for instance, during World War II, when the Germans came into into Holland. They separated Northern Holland from Southern Holland. They blew up the bridge. So the folks in Northern Holland didn't get food supplies for, crap, for months, And at the end, and by the time the Allies got to that region, they were eating tulips. Now, what's important to note about that is they did a study, their government did a study looking at the offspring of these individuals who went through this. And their offspring today have diabetes, heart disease, anxiety. Some of them have had serious mental illnesses. That all stems from what happened to their parents during this so they call it the Dutch famine. During the Dutch famine. Now, they also followed up that study, looking at those offspring, and sure enough, they saw the same pattern. So
because it passes down culturally as well as genetically. Genetic predispositions plus cultural affirmation.
That's right. Correct. It doesn't mean that everybody is going to manifest symptoms, but enough did in this study, right, to really give us some conclusive evidence that intergenerational trauma is real, and it impacts us. And so, what is the antidote to this? We know it exists. So what do we do? The first thing we do, and I think I indicated this before, but I want to make sure I underscore it again. You need to be aware that it exists. Racism is not a figment of your imagination. It is a reality that you live every single day. Whether you deny it exists or not, it's still acting upon you, right, in ways that you may not be aware of. And the evidence, look no further than healthcare. Look no further than mental health care and the disparities that exist between whites and blacks. Look no further than infant mortality or maternal mortality, where Reuben indicated earlier, Black women succumb more to death during pregnancy than any other group in the world. African Americans have the highest infant mortality than any group in the world. And we live in a so-called Western society. Now, what is causing this? When you look and compare women who are educated, who have reasonably good health, and you compare that woman who had a kid to a white woman, what's the difference in terms of the economics of it? Nothing. But when you look at the fact that the African-American woman is carrying these epigenetic tags in them that make it difficult, I think that contributes to the early death that women, African-American women, experience, and also the low birth rate phenomena that you mentioned earlier. Stress is what's causing this. Living in a society where stress, particularly racial stress, is afoot. And so the way to deal with, one way is a complete awareness, one. Two, educate yourself. Start reading books about race. Black people, we're just as ignorant about it as white folks. We know something is going on. We feel it, but we don't know how to interpret it. We try hard to resist that moniker of racism, right? Oh, it can't be. I don't want to play into racism. Dog, it's racism, okay? If your spidey senses is telling you that something is not right, it's likely going to be racism that you're going to have to contend with and deal with. So being aware of it is a protective factor. It's something that you can use to protect you against the nonsense that occurs simply just because you were born Black in a white racist supremacist society. I'm not saying that all white people are racist. I'm saying that the system itself, systemically is flawed and is heavily tilted toward white folks.
Right. And what we got to do, and what in our work that we do together, what we always do, what I do every day is I don't try to shame people who are not Black for being born who they are. Nobody chose their race. We are who we are. We wake up who we are. But what I say to people is, if you're not aware of what you do, the policies that you create, the way you move and interact with people, you enable and you can perpetuate, or you can end and you can take away the trauma that has been created and is sustained and is systemic. So let's do this too, Darron. I'm going to open up the lines. If you want to call in and talk to Dr. Smith, you can give us a call at 252-937-7400 or 872-9210. And if people call in, that's great. And if they don't, we're just going to keep on talking. Let's talk about some innovative technologies. You're a neuroscientist. You know, I didn't talk about everything that you do. Why don't you tell us what neuroscience is and tell us what are let's begin to talk about some treatments for mental health through the use of technology and the concepts that govern this whole area of brain science.
You bet, you bet. So neuroscience is basically the study of brain function, how the brain functions, and that includes brain waves. Our consciousness, the fact that we're conscious is really a function of brainwave activity that's going on inside of our head, automatically at any given time. Well, what one doesn't realize that you can actually take those brain waves, and just like you train a dog to sit down, stay here, you can train your brain waves to stay within a certain frequency. Because some of the issues, some of the symptoms that people experience when they're going through PTSD or having or depressed is a function of how fast and slow brain waves are being generated in certain areas of the brain. The magic happens above the eyebrows and below the hairline. That's where the magic happens. That's where our brains are different from our cousins. By the way, have any of you gone to the zoo recently and visits your cousin? I'm gonna ask you to go visit your cousins. Your cousins are in the zoo, and there's two general species. There's the bonobos, and then there's the common chimp. I want to admonish the audience to go and visit your cousins. You're about 2% difference in genetics between those two, particularly bonobos and us. 98% match genetically. So that 2% difference is this neocortex, that area above the eyebrows and below the hairline. That's where all the magic happens. That's where we spend a great deal of time regulating our emotions, suppressing our emotions, right, from exploding. It's an area where mathematical genius occurs, where language is formed. It's an area where we're creative. It's an area where we learn how to work with it. So the reason why we're here, the reason why we are here now, you and I, for example, is because genetically we hit the lotto, right? So people who are here today were born today because they have positive pro-social behaviors. That doesn't always happen, but generally that's the gist. Meaning that humans survived because we learned to share with each other, cooperate with each other, share knowledge and information with one another. So this is the basis of us in our existence as humans. So yeah, that's kind of what I was kind
So
of.
how do you measure that? Okay, so if I'm a person that is predisposed to depression, how do I get out of being depressed? And y'all can't see him. If you're looking at Facebook, you see Darron with this bicycle helmet looking thing on his head. Talk to us about what that is.
So using the principles of neuroscience, right, to sort of reverse some of the symptoms that people experience with depression and anxiety and PTSD, you can use technology as a really great basis for that. So the first go-to is medication. We always go to medication because it works. There's a history that medicine works, but not for everyone. And there's other ways to augment the effects of medication. One would be with technology. This is called photobiomodulation. And essentially what it is, it's 256 diodes of light, red light. You can't see that. I'm sorry, you can't see that, but it's penetrating my skull and getting into the deep centers of my brain that are responsible for my moods, right? How my level of awakeness and awokeness. The brain is firing on all cylinders. More energy is generated inside the brain with this device. So it's a medical device, but it does have benefit and efficacy for people who are struggling with depression, Alzheimer's, cognitive kinds of disorders. So I'll usually use this when I'm treating people with mental illness. The second most innovative thing I want to share with the audience in terms of technology is a device. And one of the areas that I specialize in is called neurofeedback therapy. That sounds weird, huh? Neuro, of course, is nerve cells. So this goes back to what I was saying earlier, audience, about you can train your brain waves to sit and stay like a dog, and you can, and it's pretty doggone dope. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Let's see if I can undo this background so y'all can see this better. And I'm not sure if I can. Okay, here we go. So if you look at this device, can y'all see this? Can you see this,
Mhm.
Rev?
Mhm.
If you look at this device and you see this little doohickey at the top of this, these are a set of glasses. This is
Mhm.
an electrode, right? And this
Mhm. Mhm.
electrode sits, I can position it to sit on different parts of my brain that I know are responsible for my mood. So when I look through these glasses, look weird as hell. I mean, weird as heck. I'll borrow the white people's term, heck. And this is the controller. When I'm looking at you and we're talking, this darkness of this light will come in and out where I can see you clearly, then it'll go dark again. So what's happening is that I'm telling this through computer brain interface, this device here, I'm telling this device and programming it to tell this electrode to fire at between 8 to 12 hertz. Anything over 8 to 12 hertz is bad. Anything under 8 hertz is bad. I want it right between 8 to 12 hertz. When it's between 8 to 12 hertz, the darkness becomes light. When it's not, it goes dark like this. So,
Mhm.
and what's happening is that I'm training my brain waves. Alpha waves are the waves that we generate when we're calm, right? We should be awake, alert, relaxed, and calm. That's the state, the brain state that we want to be in to optimize our ability to learn and our ability to be functional as humans.
So if we don't have access to the technology, how are there some coping mechanisms, techniques that we can get to that heightened state of uh, you know, where we want to be? What did you say? Awake, relaxed, calm,
Right.
whatever those adjectives were.
Alert, relaxed, and focused. That's what you want to be. That's the state.
Alert, awake,
Relaxed
relaxed,
and
and
focused.
focused. Awake, alert, relaxed, and focused. What can a person do if they don't have access to technology, they don't have access to medicine? What can we do to intentionally create that state of calm in our minds? You know, when the whole world is crazy around us, DEI is now officially cut out of the UNC system. So people just lost their jobs because some people got mad that it's too many educated Black folk in systems and it's disrupting somebody else's comfort. And that's what that's all about. So, how do I maintain my sense of calm when I just got fired? How do I maintain my sense of calm when I just got disrespected? How do I maintain my sense of calm when my whole world just got turned upside down? When somebody says, now you don't get a chance to get into this university because we are not going to use equity as a marker anymore of opportunity for you. But we can use legacy. If your grandfather attended this university, you are being able to give special privilege. But hey, my grandfather couldn't attend because Black folk couldn't go to UNC. So how do I maintain my state of calm when all this stuff is happening to me? What do I do?
Well, I mean, coping is going to be different for everybody, but generally, again, if people are having symptoms that I described earlier, it might warrant medication. That's the first step. The second step is exercise. You have to find
Mm.
a way to vent and vent in a healthy way. So going for a walk, going for a run, whatever you fancy, going to a hip hop class or step class, something that will take your mind off of the persistent psychological pain one feels when things like that happen. Um, so another thing we can do for those are things you do for free. The other thing I would recommend is learning how to engage in mindfulness, breathing. Learning how to control one's breath can help to generate those 8 to 12 hertz of positive brain waves that I mentioned earlier, that we discussed earlier. So those are some of the things that you can do for free. They may not be the best things to do, but they can certainly help. Talking to a friend, someone who can listen to you with a loving and objective, disposition. going to someone, maybe going to a therapist or going to a clergy person, if that fancies you, so talking to people about this and not holding and bottling it in. And then learning, and then another thing too, and one of the things I've learned to do is, in a white supremacist society is never take anything for granted. I mean, just you have to recognize that they give it and they take it away. I mean, that little bit of the only one of the the horrible death of George Floyd brought about these short-term changes that took place. And again, white folks, when they feel black people are getting too much, they cut and run.
Right, right. And let's talk about we got about 4 minutes. We got 4 minutes, Darron. I don't know if we can do justice. I might have to just have you come back again another time. But let's talk about some other novel treatments. Let's talk about treatment that I'm learning more about and that we're finding that we're able to reclaim as a people, as a heritage, and then in appropriate, safe medical environments. Let's talk about psychedelics. What is psychedelics?
Psychedelics is an emerging field that uses earth-based, plant-based medicine that's been around here for millennia, that various peoples were using all over the world in rituals, in ceremonies. Some of these plant-based medicines you may have heard of: peyote, ayahuasca, psilocybin, or mushrooms. Magic mushrooms is what people refer to them on the streets. These medicines, believe it or not, are making a serious comeback. And what we found is in some of the earlier studies some of them were enormously flawed, but some of the outcomes of these earlier studies, this stuff works. People really seem to get better quicker, and the changes are more lasting than they would if they took maybe Paxil or Zoloft, for instance, for PTSD. So they're showing a lot of promise. There's been a lot of research that's gone into these medications over the last 30 years. And I'm happy to report that the FDA is poised to reschedule MDMA, which on the street people call it Molly on the street. But of course, it's not pure MDMA that we're talking about. Molly is unfortunately cut with all kind of stuff: cocaine, fentanyl, the nasty stuff. But MDMA has been shown, it's what's called an empathogen. And people who take it and use it under a very supervised protocol learn to develop more self-love, learn to see the world in a much different way, which is very helpful in terms of dealing with the stresses of life. And so I'm very excited about what's happening in regards to psychedelic medicine. And so something that I'm very committed to, and I'd certainly like to educate the Black community more about these medicines, because certainly there's a lot of unfortunately misinformation and disinformation about these medicines and their purpose. So, and I'm happy to also report that much of these medicines were used by our ancestors. And so it's like the chickens coming home to roost.
And what we're also finding is that there is a whole move around the nation to not just be engaged in its use, but learning how to create a whole industry from it. And I think one of the things that we can talk about at another time is how Black people are able to get in on the front end of this whole movement to legalize. It's not just a substance, it's a medicine, to legalize the medicine, to create therapies in tandem with the medicine that create intentional recovery from these long-term traumatic psychological harms that have been imposed upon us that we have perpetuated ourselves.
Right.
So that's something that we'll have to pick up at another time.
But we really should, just to kind of add to that, we really should go there, because a lot of Black folks walk around with a lot of crazy ideas about these medicines they learned from, the war on drugs. Just say all this. So if we can kind of set the record straight on that, it'd be real helpful. Hey, audience, how come nobody called in? What's going on out there? Nobody called in.
Yeah, it's too late now. So we're going to have to start out the program maybe with pushing the phone numbers, but you've seeded us with great knowledge and information, Dr. Smith. We really appreciate the time and the attention that you've given to us. Thank you for the work that you're doing in the field of mental health, not just in Seattle, but across the country and right here in North Carolina too. Look so forward to having more good talk with you. Thank you for taking the time from your day job. Love that background. Love to see what's happening in the state of Washington. So audience, we're gonna check out. I wanna thank God for Darron Smith. Dr. Smith, we thank you. Thank you for listening to Choice FM. Reuben Blackwell, Express Yourself. We're signing out, but we'll see you later. Have a great day. Have a great week. God bless.
Choice FM is live at 5.
But it's like this, the South got something to say. That's all I got to say.
Reuben Blackwell and Express Yourself on Choice FM.